This isn't a legitimate by-election. It's one that's been called in order to short-circuit parliamentary standards. Rupert Lowe not standing is the right thing. I don't think the Conservatives should stand, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats should boycott the by-election as well.
Reform gets a level of scrutiny from the media that is off the scale compared to other political parties. You know, the Financial Times recently... No, absolutely.
Come off. I was sitting here politely listening.
100%. He is a man who knows what he believes and cannot be balked.
What a lot of people wonder is, are you a bunch of egomaniacs squabbling between yourselves for control, and that the only reason you're now against Nigel Farage is because you want to be the boss? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Nigel Farage is trying to take back control of the scandal around his finances, facing mounting questions and a parliamentary standards inquiry which could prompt a recall petition and by-election. He has preempted it all and forced one himself. He's pitching it as the people against the establishment, the chance to flick two fingers at the media and political opponents and prove he's done nothing wrong. But will it work? Will it resolve any of the questions about who gave him money, why, and why he didn't declare it? Is this a genius masterstroke by a brilliant tactician, or a desperate stunt by an angry man that could backfire? And is it effectively an admission that the inquiry will find he broke the rules? Joining us, the former Conservative, now Reform-supporting commentator Tim Montgomerie, former Reform deputy leader turned Farage critic and rival Ben Habib, and from More in Common, the pollster Luke Tryll. Thank you all for joining us. Tim, I mean, he knew this was going against him. It's an admission of guilt, isn't it?
I don't think so. I don't think he's handled this affair particularly well. I think he's looked too defensive in some of the interviews that he's conducted, and he hasn't conducted enough interviews. But I think reform gets a level of scrutiny from the media that is off the scale compared to other political parties. You know, the Financial Times recently... No, absolutely.
Come off. I was sitting here politely listening.
100%. I've just criticised Nigel Farage. I don't take the party line. But, you know, the FT recently led with a reform councillor in Kent resigning. Look, that's the nature of it. We have to face up to it. Reform is an insurgent party. I get why there may be good reasons why we need to be tested more. But reform threatens both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. A parliamentary process where ultimately Labour and Conservative MPs decide whether Nigel Farage gets suspended or not is not going to be fair. Much fairer to go... Hang on, just 1 second. Much fairer to go to the voters of Clacton. We're in a democracy. Let voters decide.
Well, except they don't know. They don't know the truth, do they? Well, the Commissioner hasn't ruled. There hasn't been an inquiry. He hasn't had the chance to answer or ask any questions. Well, what are they going to be voting on? Nigel Farage's version of the truth?
Well, I thought you conducted a journalism exercise. You examining Nigel Farage all the time. The idea that the voters of Clacton do not have a lot of information with which to judge whether Nigel Farage should continue as their MP or not, that's for the birds. They have plenty of information.
So you don't resign if you're innocent. You resign when you're guilty. As it happens, I'm not suggesting that he is guilty. There's a process that has to be gone through. But if you feel you're going to be found guilty, that's when it becomes politically expedient to resign. And what he's done here, which you've alluded to very cleverly, is forestall the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner's ruling and take it back to the people, casting himself as David versus Goliath. But actually, that's not what's happening here. We're not talking about the establishment picking up on, free sunglasses, for example, which used to exercise Nigel Farage when he was commenting on Keir Starmer. We're talking about fundamentally a £5 million gift, which was made only a couple of months before the general election in 2024, which by any sensible man's yardstick should have been declared on the register because of the 12-month prior rule that Parliament has. It's so obvious what's happening here that he's stepping round the very necessary scrutiny over £5 million.
If it's so obvious, then let the voters of Clacton decide.
No.
They will agree with you if it's so obvious.
So I'll come to that in a second, if I may. But the £5 million wasn't from a mate. It was from someone who donated £14 million to the Brexit Party and who since has donated £15 million to Reform. This man is a political donor. And the notion that the £5 million carried no influence with it is one that I'm afraid doesn't wash with any sentient being. Of course, there must be some influence with £5 million. If he liked Farage as a friend, if he was grateful to Farage for what Farage has done, you might give him a bottle of champagne, maybe a case of champagne, but you don't hand over £5 million. And that is the scrutiny which Farage is sidestepping.
Tim?
Look, about a year or so ago, Elon Musk was basically trying to buy Reform. He wanted Nigel Farage to agree to a whole series of very right-wing views. When Nigel Farage didn't, Elon Musk backed people like Ben
This is wrong.
Rupert Lowe.
Tim, this is just factually incorrect.
Well, I only interrupted you once. You've interrupted me every time I've started to start to make a point. No,
factually
again and again, there are people like Tommy Robinson that Nigel Farage stands up to. He is not a man that can be bought. His policies, whether it's on Europe or immigration or welfare reform, have been long-standing.
There are two slightly different points there, aren't there? I mean, that's true. It's absolutely true that Nigel Farage has rejected the far right, has rejected Tommy Robinson, has rejected Elon Musk, and Ben, we'll talk a little bit about that because you have backed.
He gets very little credit
or
for
shared
it.
platforms
with
Tommy Robinson, but that's a separate question to the 5 million.
It's about whether he could be
why
bought,
he accepted
whether he could be influenced,
and whether he can be influenced by. Who can't be influenced by £5 million? That's the question. I mean, the question around the 5 million is: would Nigel Farage have decided he was going to stand for Parliament if he hadn't been given £5 million worth of financial security? Those are the questions we don't know the answers to going into this new by-election.
I began by saying I don't think he's handled this affair particularly well. He does need to acknowledge that this isn't a box of chocolates or a bottle of champagne.
Do you think
it's a very substantial gift.
Do you think it influenced his decision to go back into Parliament?
I've tried to already. That's why I mentioned the Robinson and the Elon Musk and his long-standing issues, because he is a man who knows what he believes and cannot be bought.
I don't mean on an issue. I mean on the decision to go into Parliament. Do you think it influenced his decision to go into Parliament, knowing that he now had this £5 million nest egg in his bank account?
Well, what influences Nigel Farage all of the time is that he gets up every day knowing it could be his last day. The security threats to him are enormous. I think if he lives another 20 years, the security bill he will face...
Separate question.
No, it isn't. The security bill he will face is probably about £10 million. You're presenting it as like a political gift. It's a gift to help him afford his own security.
But as Ben says, it was a gift by a political donor in the year before he became an MP, while he was the owner of Reform and the honorary president. The idea that Nigel Farage was not a politician in some form.
So that's a very important point.
He took this money. It's nonsense.
May I just develop that point? Because he's repeatedly said in the last few days that he wasn't politically active. Nigel Farage has been politically active non-stop since 2019 as majority shareholder and director of Reform UK. Every single thing he's done with that in the background. And so if you are donating £5 million to the controller of Reform UK, the idea that that won't have some bearing on Reform UK, as I say, doesn't pass muster with any sentient being. And that is the heart of the issue here. And it's not just a parliamentary standards thing either. This is an electoral commission thing, because the electoral commission has Nigel Farage, as it does all members of a political party, down as a regulated donee. He should have declared every single donation as a political activity between 2019 and 2024. There's not a single declaration to the electoral commission. Not a single declaration.
Let me bring in Luke Tryll now.
I'd like to respond to some of those points.
Well, okay, respond to that first, and then I'll bring in...
I am conceding one very substantial point. It needs to be transparent. That was a mistake. Why I think the by-election is the right way of resolving this is Ben makes his point, the case against Nigel. He doesn't ever have a good word to say about Nigel anymore. It's ridiculous. He will never find any good in Nigel. Other people in Parliament won't. Let the voters of Clacton listen to people like Ben, listen to people like me, and weigh it up. They have to decide whether Nigel Farage is the sort of person, as you imply, Chris, who can be bought, who'll be influenced, or actually...
I'm not implying he can be bought. All I'm saying is is it reasonable to think that if you've been given £5 million, that might influence your decision to go into Parliament or not, wherein, at a time when Nigel Farage was saying he was skint and,
Insofar as it afforded the security that enabled
Exactly.
it, maybe that, but I don't think the voters of Clacton will have any objection
Now we
to
talk
that.
about the competition that's coming. Restore, while we've been speaking, Rupert Lowe's lot, who are sort of the splinter group and sort of allied with you in a way, Ben, have said that they are not going to stand in this election.
But how weak?
Which is a very interesting move. Now, Luke, tell us about what has been happening over the last few weeks of this controversy swirling to Reform's polling numbers, because they're still out front, aren't they?
They are. So, Reform have led in the opinion polls now for well over a year. They're not, I should say, as high as they have been. So if you look at last summer and early autumn, they were bumping into the low 30s. They now tend to be in the sort of high 20s across polling, but the gap has definitely narrowed, but they remain ahead of the other political parties. There is some hypothetical polling when you put Andy Burnham in as Labour leader, where it looks like Labour might nudge ahead of Reform, but only just, and that is, of course, only hypothetical polling. But at the moment, at least, Reform remain the front runners. They remain ahead, even if their lead is slightly narrower than it has been.
But what data do you have on what the general public have made of all these questions around the donations? Not just the 5 million, but the new one around George Cottrell and the support he was giving Nigel Farage before the election as well.
So when you ask people the extent to which the 5 million, if we focus on that, affects people's view, and particularly whether it negatively impacts their view of Nigel Farage, around 57% say that it has a negative impact, whereas around a third say it doesn't really affect their view of him at all. It's worth saying that number who says it has a negative impact on their view of Farage has increased since May. So when we asked back in May, it was about 10 points lower, the number saying it negatively impacted their view. But interestingly, and I think this is the really important point, amongst Reform 2024 voters, so the people who backed Reform at the last general election, they are much less likely than average to say that it affects their view of him. In fact, 74% say it doesn't affect their view of Nigel Farage. And so you've got a bit of a mismatch. Basically, what it seems like when you look at the polling, particularly on the 5 million, which is what we've got, is those who don't like Nigel Farage don't like him even more as a result, or say they don't. Those who are the sort of true supporters of Reform UK say, actually, it doesn't make much of a difference. I think the group that Nigel Farage has to worry about are the middle group. They are people who didn't back Reform in 2024, but might be open to backing them in future, the group that takes Reform from 15% of the vote up to 30%. And amongst that group, they're still, less likely than the general public to say that this is an issue, but more of them do say it's an issue. And they are the group that I think Reform needs to really focus on and convince that this is all above board.
So Ben, it's quite Trumpian, isn't it, the way public opinion is moving now? If you back him no matter what, it seems.
It is interesting that, yeah.
And it doesn't, he could, I think Trump said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. We're almost in that world now where it doesn't matter what your man does or woman, once you back them, you back them. But in that, is that middle group anything to worry about?
Yeah, I think it is, absolutely. It may not be anything to worry about in Clacton. Clacton we'll see the result of that soon. But that is the group you need to carry to win a general election. And so if this weighs on that middle group, then even if he wins Clacton, he's going to feel that he's got uphill struggle all the way to the general election. And can I just add one more thing? It's not just the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner that's looking at Farage. The Financial Conduct Authority has also had an application made to review his conduct post the donation from Christopher Harbon because of promotion of cryptocurrencies and so on. So even if he wins this by-election, there could be more trouble for Farage down the road, and he's going to be fighting this all the way through to a general election. And that middle group will be increasingly swayed by all this negative news because they won't like it.
I mean,
If you're so confident, we now know that Rupert Lowe's not going to stand. Why don't you stand against Nigel Benn? If you believe this case is so overwhelming, make it to the voters of Clacton.
I think it's really brilliant thinking from Rupert Lowe not to stand. This isn't a legitimate by-election. It's one that's been called in order to short-circuit parliamentary standards. That's why it's been called.
As Margaret Thatcher would say, Frit, you're Frit.
And Rupert Lowe, I don't know whatever Frit means. Rupert Lowe not standing is the right thing. I don't think the Conservatives should stand, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats should boycott the by-election as well.
I mean, isn't the bigger point, Tim, that what Ben raises is that, assuming he comes back, he hasn't resolved anything. The investigations start again. Other investigations may carry on. And he will say, well, this is just the establishment coming after reform. You've been around politics long enough, not to believe that all of these institutions are just corrupt and rigged and all the rest of it. There are real, people of integrity in all of these institutions, and rules are there to be obeyed, aren't they?
Look, I have been around a long time. I was there with Ian Duncan Smith with the parliamentary inquiry into his wife's service as his secretary. And I saw it with the Boris investigation into Partygate. I saw it with Owen Paterson. I know these investigations, and you're right, there are good people involved, but they're not judicial processes. Owen Paterson, for example, couldn't put witnesses forward. There is just one judge who makes the decision. There isn't a prosecution and a defence, and then MPs decide. So it is a process with some authority, but it is not a court of law, and it doesn't have the court of law standards. So ultimately, these are political judgments as to whether you accept the outcome of these processes. They aren't legal in that traditional sense. And that is why I think asking voters to make the ultimate decision is the right way of going about this.
Are you comfortable with sort of undermining all our British institutions?
No, because
by saying, well, it's not criminal. No one's saying it's criminal. It's about whether it's right and proper and decent and in the spirit of democracy.
Well, I think it'd be good for Channel 4 News to investigate this, because there are some real deficits in these processes. That's all I'm saying. And I'm saying that these processes can be fishing expeditions. I mean, they start with one problem and then they look at other things. And I know that there are certain newspapers, almost on a weekly basis, Reform MPs and leaders are getting extraordinarily rubbish accusations that are never published. One week after another, there is an awful lot of journalistic investigation into reform, and a lot of it is politically motivated.
Can I just ask, before this raised its head, there were 17 failures to disclose registrable interest by Nigel Farage, adding up to £384,000. This is not a one-off instance. This is a litany of a failure to abide by the code of conduct of Parliament. And Parliament is a democratic body. It's not just an institution. It is the representative institution of our democracy. So to say that, it's the establishment against me is basically to attack the very heart of British democracy. And just one more thing, if I may. On the Parliamentary Standards Committee, there are 7 MPs, but there are also 7 lay people. And they're not party political, and they contribute to the process. So even though it's not judicial, it's quite an extended, detailed affair.
So are you surprised by this behaviour of Nigel Farage?
I'm not surprised. I mean, if you go back and you look at Nigel Farage's history as a European member of the European Parliament, there were multiple probes into his financial probity. And even as recently, before this thing blew up, he said he'd bought that house in Clacton. Then it transpired that actually it was his partner who'd bought the house in Clacton. And questions are still about how she could afford it, given her background and so on. There's a lot of weirdness that's around the finances of this individual. And it's a problem for reform. It's not the establishment creating these problems. He said that I bought that house in Clacton. Then suddenly it was his partner.
The idea that,
which bit's
the
untrue?
idea that
Which bit's
Nigel
untrue?
Farage is only interested in making money. This man has been involved in politics for a quarter of a century. He's taken up cause after cause, which, like Brexit, was very unpopular at the beginning. He takes causes and he transforms public opinion. This is a man with deep beliefs who faces enormous security threats by staying involved in politics. He's a man that's probably made more difference in politics than people who've been prime minister.
You're saying
To slur him as just interested in making money is just rubbish.
That's what he told me at supper.
Well, it's just not true, is it?
Well, it's true. It is true.
He told you himself at supper.
Yeah, I said, look, this was in August 2020, and I said, Nigel, Rupert Lowe, Robert Rowland, and I took Nigel Farage out for supper at my expense, quite a salubrious supper. And I asked him, all three of us asked him, please get back into campaigning mode. We need you to hold Boris Johnson's feet to the fire because the trade agreement he's negotiating with the EU is not a good one. And he turned round to me and he said, Ben, it's fine for you. You were born with a silver spoon up your backside. But I've been in politics for 20 odd years and I need to make money. At that point, I concluded this man's not interested in politics.
Needing to make money is not the same as being obsessed only with money. You take the most uncharitable view of Nigel Farage.
I'm telling you what he said at supper.
I mean, Nigel Farage is not here to give us his version of that dinner. So, we'll have to, accept what you say about your account and assume that he would contest it.
For me, it was a very important dinner because it showed me someone who wasn't prepared to fight.
I'm more interested in a quarter of a century of political involvement than what happens at one dinner
there is no
hearsay.
doubt that Nigel Farage is committed to a number of political causes, including Brexit.
We can have that debate. We can have that debate too.
You said he was only interested in making money.
I just want to ask Luke about what we were talking about a moment ago, which was about the institutions and the establishment, as Farage would paint them out. Now, we know that there is a crisis of trust in elected politics. Does the public's suspicions and lack of trust extend to all these other institutions, whether it's the Financial Conduct Authority, HMRC, the parliamentary standards? Are all of those things equally suspicious?
Well, look, it is definitely fair to say that trust in lots of institutions beyond politics has eroded in recent years. And things like judicial systems, interestingly, have become more polarised. It tends to be that more socially liberal members of the public tend to back the judiciary more than more socially conservative members. But, and I think this is really important in this case, when you pitch one of those institutions against a politician, those institutions come out on top. So people are more likely to trust HMRC, the Financial Conduct Authority, than they are any politician. And that will include someone like Nigel Farage. And I think it's quite dangerous, again, politically, to go to war against them. It's not the same as, criticising fellow politicians or even criticising something like the civil service, because people will say, well, hang on a minute, they're holding you to account. I do tend to trust them over you because you're a politician and I don't trust politicians.
So the people versus the establishment may not work.
No, I think it may not. If the establishment is saying you are kind of bang to rights on, this issue, so if it's HMRC saying you haven't done that, if it's the FCA saying you haven't done that, if you look at the other case, look at Angela Rayner's tax affairs, there is no way that Angela Rayner could have run an anti-HMRC campaign and come out on top. Similarly, I don't think Farage would be able to against a body like HMRC. That is very different, though, to fellow politicians in Parliament.
Can we talk about George Cottrell now? Because this is the latest story that the Sunday Times have revealed. Was George Cottrell around Nigel Farage when you were around Reform?
Yeah, my entrance into politics was in, I think, March 2019 or thereabouts, and George Cottrell was around then, and he's been around throughout. What
was his role, function?
Well, I remember sending my first donation to the Brexit Party, as it was called then, to George Cottrell. He was handling the receipt of donations, and that's what he was doing then. But he's never really, as far as I can see, had an official role in the party. He's just in and around Nigel Farage. Maybe Tim can shed some more light on George.
I hardly know him. Clearly, he committed an offence, but he served, justice. He's written a book about how to combat the kind of activity he was involved in. He's trying to make good, and so I think everything I think in the Sunday Times article probably was factually correct, but I don't really know what they were trying to say. I don't think any criminal offence or law was broken. What they were trying to highlight was someone who did wrong things in the past is in Nigel's orbit. Perhaps Nigel needs to consider whether that's politically savvy. But actually,
what do you think?
The smear that's being made, on top of the legitimate questions, which I've already conceded about the £5 million gift, I think what newspapers do, what journalism do, they try and create this sense that there's lots of things wrong. And I don't think this particular story added up to anything other than going through stuff that we already knew about.
But you hint it may not be sensible for Nigel Farage to be hanging around with a convicted criminal who served time in an American jail. I mean, is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying...
It's all very well to be forgiving, but...
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to make difficult decisions in politics, and Jonathan Aitken, people who've done wrong, they don't go back into politics. And Nigel may just have to be careful as to who he associates with himself, because he is not going to be judged fairly by a press that is largely hostile when stories like this come up.
Wasn't the point of that story not just that he's hanging out with a convicted fraudster, but that these may be other things that should have been declared? You know, that this was the use of a property, payments for security, for social media, in the year before he was elected, that have also not been declared. That was the point of that story. And the other thing that may happen now as a result of this is that the clock gets reset on what Nigel Farage has to declare. Because when he comes back to Parliament, assuming he's re-elected, it's only the 12 months before that by-election. So if there's anything else that we don't know about in the run-up to the 2024 election, Nigel Farage is no longer needed to declare it. That's quite clever.
To Parliament.
Yes.
But he does to the Electoral Commission.
I think Ben is right on this, actually. I think it's more complicated than you just set out. And I think even if it's wiped clean in terms of Parliament, you won't lose interest, and quite rightly, you won't lose interest. The press will continue to follow these things.
But do you think it's wrong
these things
to pursue donations?
What I do believe, Trish, is I think part of why Nigel Farage has been quite angry and irritable and underperforming in interviews of late is he knows he messed up. I think privately he knows he should have been more transparent. I think
think he should have declared?
I think, yes, I do. And I think he does, really. And we all make mistakes. And Ben is also right. There's been too many mistakes by Nigel Farage on reporting. There's understandable. He's busy. He's building a party from scratch. The lesson to be learned from this, and this is my big question about Nigel Farage, is lots of things are not happening in reform that need to be happening in reform. On seat and candidate selection, on reporting, on regular structural meetings with his colleagues, the kind of thing that a grown-up political party does, and a man who really wants to be Prime Minister does. And for me, this by-election is a distraction from that. Nigel Farage needs to get a lot more serious when hopefully he wins the by-election, because if reform is going to be the government that people trust after what I think will be a Tory failure in government and then a Labour failure in government, we will have the tyres kicked like no other political party. And we're not ready for that process yet. And I hope we've got a full 3 years of the Parliament to be ready. And Nigel needs to get much more serious about all of that.
Ben, we've already established that Restore aren't fighting, but can we just talk about the splintering of the right and the threat it poses to any ambitions of reform to form the next government? I mean, what a lot of people wonder is, are you a bunch of egomaniacs squabbling between yourselves for control? And that the only reason you're now against Nigel Farage is because you want to be the boss. And the only reason Rupert Lowe's got his own party is because he wanted to be the boss. And that you're all just power hungry.
No, not at all. I don't believe Farage is the deep thinking political sort of bastion of democracy, sovereignty, borders, and all of that. I think Farage is actually a political chameleon in many ways. He pivots on one issue to another, depending on the constituency to which he's talking. He seeks popularity, a bit like Boris Johnson, over political principle. And I think he's deeply dangerous in any form of office. I think he would be deeply dangerous to this country. And I think he would trash the narrative for a sovereign, proud, prosperous United Kingdom, one that I firmly believe in. And when I left Reform for those reasons. And when I set up Advance UK, which is the political party...
But you're also to the right of him, aren't you?
Well, I don't know how you define right.
And you flirt with Tommy Robinson.
I don't flirt with Tommy Robinson. Can I just say one thing about my ego before we get there? I set up Advance UK because I felt there was a need for a serious, principled political party that would not take the knee every moment, every opportunity it got, a bit like Farage does. And I can give you lots of examples of where he drops the ball at a crucial moment or changes his position. But the minute Restore emerged, and the minute Restore started showing itself not to be just a social media phenomena, but actually manifesting itself in real electoral politics, they won 10 out of the 10 seats that they stood in the local elections in the Great Yarmouth area. They got 7% straight off the blocks in Makerfield. These are significant results. I decided to set Advance UK back. I've applied now for deregistration of Advance UK as a political party. So it's got nothing to do with my ego. It's all about doing what's right for this country. And actually, I think Reform would have been in a much better place if Farage had stood back and allowed someone else now to take over. They would have been able to build on the platform they have. Sadly, it's going to be more of a media circus now as it goes forward.
Right, but you shared platforms with
Robinson,
haven't
on Tommy
you?
Robinson.
A lot of people find that confusing as well, given your own Pakistani background.
Yeah, so first of all, Tommy Robinson's not a racist. I would not share a platform with a racist. There are lots of people from ethnic minority backgrounds.
He's anti-Muslim.
So he's got a real problem with Islam. But that's not racist. That's not racism. Islam ultimately is a religion, it's a philosophy, it's an ideology.
Religious bigotry, isn't it?
Well, look, do you want to have a debate on Islam? Or do you want to have a debate about Tommy Robinson? I mean, look, Islam is a...
You can't say a good word about Nigel Farage and you're not willing to criticise Tommy Robinson. Look, that says everything about you, I'm afraid, Ben. And the idea that you are not on an ego trip, the only reason you're not pursuing your political party is you didn't get any support. When you fought a by-election, you got hundreds of votes,
that was the first by-election.
Well, yeah, but you didn't get any support. Tim, that's why you wound it up. Let's not pretend you were doing this out of the national interest. Tim, the problem is, Luke may confirm this, Britain is now becoming a left-wing country. You look at attitudes of young people. There's a canonisation of Britain. If the right is divided in that circumstance, the right's in a hell of a lot of trouble. I don't agree with everything Nigel does. I don't agree with everything that Reform does. But if you continue to work outside political parties, if you make every disagreement an issue where you run away and form your own party, or try to form your own party, the right will lose. The right in Britain is becoming like the left used to be, People's Front of Judea, etc., etc. We've got to start learning to work with each other and accept compromise. And I'm afraid people like Ben and Rupert will destroy the right and will destroy conservatism in this country because they aren't team players.
The only party that destroyed conservatism in this country is your former party, the Conservative Party. I left them. They had 200 years being unopposed on the so-called right. And they needed opposition because they had become, as we now all describe them to be, the uniparty, almost indistinguishable, shades of grey between them and the Labour Party. The Conservative Party was the problem. Farage, however, is not the solution. He is a political opportunist. Just coming back to my party and its failure to get traction. We got 30,000 members in 3 months. We became the 7th largest political party by membership in 3 months. There was real need for it. And on Tommy Robinson, I do not endorse what Tommy Robinson says. A lot of what Tommy Robinson says I find abhorrent, but he has 3 to 4 million peaceful, law-abiding British citizens who follow and support him. And I've spoken at 2 rallies where the turnout was, at the first rally on the 13th of September, arguably 1 million, 3.5 million when you take those people who are watching on social media. It was an opportunity for me as a leader of a political party to connect with the people, and I took that opportunity.
Final word to Luke. Tim raised this question of, whether the splintering of the right is going to mess up their political ambitions and whether Britain is moving to the left. What's your view on all of that?
Well, look, there's no doubt that the more divided the right is, the harder it is for them to win. And you saw Restore took 7% of the vote in make a field, if they took half that, so let's say 3 or 4% across the country in a general election, we think that could cost Reform, because they take most of their votes from Reform, about 70 or 80 seats. So the difference, if Reform are polling at current levels, between them maybe getting to a majority and not. So it is a very serious threat to Reform, that split on the right. Combined with that, we've got the fact that the left are becoming much more efficient at tactical voting in a way that the right don't seem to be at the moment. So what it seems to be is, in places where Reform are the main challenger, parties of the left are getting better at knowing who is best placed to beat Reform, whether it's Labour or the Greens. There's actually some evidence from places like Bexley that progressive voters will even back the Conservatives in some seats to stop Reform from getting in. So I think Reform's
Polly
got
Toynbee said she would. So she's an example of that.
So I think there's a twin problem that Reform face going forward. One is this fracturing on the right splits their vote, but on the other side, because they're so polarizing, they really motivate progressives sometimes to hold their nose and get behind parties that they wouldn't. Both of those things Reform needs to sort if it wants to be on course for a majority.
Luke Tryll, Ben Habib, Tim Montgomerie. That's been absolutely fascinating. We could do another hour of this, and we should definitely try and come back and do this again. Thank you all so much for your time. That's the Fourcast. Things are moving fast. Bye-bye.